Hello, welcome to the section creating a VPC with subnets. For example, custom mode VPC and shared VPC. So VPC stands for Virtual Private Cloud. Essentially amounts to being able to create an isolated, meaning it only talks, devices on it only talk amongst themselves. And it's a virtual, meaning it's in the cloud network. It's principally used by compute engine or things that run on compute engine like GKE. Also can be used by app engine flex environment. So essentially what that does is allows you to have compute instances be able to talk amongst themselves. And that's principally what it's about. There are two modes which you can operate a VPC, right? In a project. One is auto mode, where it will automatically create one subnet per region for you. So subnets are regions, and subnets are blocks of IP addresses. That's a contiguous block. And the case of auto mode, it blocks out of one of the private 10 address spaces. In particular, it's the 10.128.00/9 block, which is pretty much half of your 10 block. Now, in particular, when you create a project, unless it's overridden as a default in your organization, you'll get what's called the default network, which is one of these auto mode networks. Custom mode, basically, when you create a custom mode VPC, it doesn't automatically create any, basically, no subnets are created, and you have more control, but then you have to do things yourself. Okay, so I think the first thing we can do is let's look at a default network. So let me go into the project, right? And if I go to menu, down to VPC, where's VPC? VPC networks. And you can see that this project came with a default network. So you can see it right here, default. And within default, you can see that it's automatically got subnets. So these are subnets. These are all different sub blocks of 10.128. So you can see there's /20s, which is, I think it's like 1024 addresses, I think. You basically have them for every region, right? And so that's what you get. So the next thing we'll look at, though, when we look at like a structure of a VPC. So if I click on the VPC itself, okay, the first thing you have are, if you find it, so the subnets, there are firewall, okay, so the firewalls. So let's talk about firewall rules, because that's kind of one of the more common things to that you have to mess around with VPCs. So let me switch back to here. So firewall rules. So what firewall rules is basically, think of them as protections around your instances that basically allow or deny traffic in and out of an instance. So again, I think the word distributed means, in this case, it means it's applied at the instance. And another concept here is called stateful. So if a rule, either ingress rule, inbound, or egress rule, outbound, if either one of those allows the traffic, then the return traffic for that same pattern, like that same like pair of IPs and ports, that return traffic is also allowed. So that's what it means to be stateful. So you have a stateful firewall basically at your instance that is controlling what's in and what's out. So there are, before we look at actual the rules themselves, there are two implied rules that kind of are not visible, but they're implied, meaning they're always in effect. And one is for egress. Let's see if I can find it here. So if it's down here it is. So egress rule right here, basically to any address, the implied rule says you're allowed to send outbound traffic. So any GCE instance by default, because of this implied rule, is allowed to send out traffic, which means The return traffic, of course, because it's stateful, the return traffic for that was also allowed. And then there's an implied rule on ingress, meaning inbound to an instance, that basically says you're denied. So nothing is allowed to talk to an instance by default. Now, so these are basically the lowest possible priorities. So that's very easy to override when you create your other rules. Okay, so this is basically the rules of last resort. Now, when you create your instance, when you create your default network, it comes with some firewall rules in addition to the implied ones that are in place. And you can delete these. And of course, if you create your own custom mode VPC, you're going to have to like create, all your rules yourself. So there's one that is, let's see if I can find it here. This one right here. So there's a default allow internal. So this is an ingress rule, right? And you can see what it's doing is it applies this IP range. It's kind of cut off here, unfortunately, because of this way this is zoomed. And maybe I can go like this. No, that didn't do any good. I don't think I can get rid of the menu here. Okay, it is what it is. See if I can find it again. Firewall rules. Okay, so we're going down to default allow internal. If I click on this, I can see it better. Yeah, so basically what this rule is, it's an inbound rule, right? Ingress. It's allowing anything from any IP address that's in basically the VPC. That's the entire VPC. And it's pretty much allowing it on all TCP, UDP, and ICMP. So this is basically all possible traffic. So you're basically allowing any traffic between instances in the VPC. So that's kind of default, allows anything, you can talk to anything. So that's the first default rule you get. The next default rule, let's see if I can find it. It's IMCP. So this one is from any address, meaning anywhere at all, right? Inside the network or outside the network, is allowed to pass ICMP, which is basically pings and such, and that's enabled, right? So it's allowing basically anything to ping anything, whether you're inside the network or from outside the network. And then there are two more rules. One is allow secure shell. So again, this is from anywhere. It's an ingress rule. So this basically says anything from anywhere can basically use TCP port 22, which is how you do secure shell, to any instance in your network, right? So this is allow you to remote into your network from anywhere in the world, okay? And then the equivalent to that for Windows is RDP. This is basically Windows version of remoting into a box. And again, it's from anywhere. So again, these rules come into play when you have a default network, because that's what gets created by default. Okay, so next is, I'm gonna pause the video for a second and get myself organized. So give me a second. Okay, so to illustrate the use of firewalls, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna fire up a GCE instance that runs a little web server. And we will observe that we cannot access that. It's going to be running on HTTP, which is port 80. And we'll observe that we cannot access it from our laptop here until we create an appropriate firewall that will allow that traffic. So I think through that, we'll see sort of how to create your own firewall rules. So this will take some time. So we'll just battle through it. I'm going to do is I'm going to go to compute, which is, and I'm going to create a VM. Let's see. Okay, create an instance. I'm going to call it instance 1. Doesn't really matter where I create it, but usually, as a habit, I usually create it in US Central. Where's the? Okay, I'll just create in Vegas, but it's interesting. I usually create it in US Central. There it is. Okay, there it is. US Central 1. And I'm going to create just use the default here in terms of the type. But let's see, I want to, where's my operating system? General purpose, okay. GPUs, container, oh, here it is, boot disk. Debian, okay, I'll just use Debian, that's fine. I think the only thing I really need to do here is I'm not going to turn on the firewalls. If I click on these, it'll actually automatically create the firewall for me, which I don't want to do first because I want it to actually fail. To get this to work, I actually need to go to networking. And at least the way I want to is I'm going to go under networking, network tags. I'm going to create a network tag here. I'm going to call it front end. So this is going to be important for our firewall. So I'm going to tag this instance with the tag front end, and I'm going to create a firewall that uses that tag. Okay. And then the other thing I want to do is this isn't be automatically a public. I have a public interface, which is fine, but I want it to have a little web server running on it. So I have to go to, let's see if I can find this thing. I need to go under, of course, now I can't find it. Security management. Let me pause the video for a second until I find this thing. Okay, what I was looking for was under management. I want to put a startup script here, which is, of course, now I can't find it. Here it is right here. So I'm going to grab some of an older video. We had a startup script that I'm just going to copy and paste here. Basically, this one will install Apache web server and just serve up a little web page automatically. So I need to copy and paste that, put this into automation. Okay, so I think if this all works right, create this. I'm going to pause the video while this gets created. So let me pause the video. Okay, I'm back. So one is I waited till instance 1 came up, and then I realized I wanted to illustrate something. So I created a second instance. The second instance doesn't run a web server. It's just a regular GCE instance. So the first thing I want to illustrate is because we have one of the default network, we have one of the firewall rules that was created by default that allows internal traffic. I should be able to access the web server on instance 1 from instance 2 just using curl, for example. So to illustrate that, I actually already logged into instance 2. And I think I just I just tested it. So this is the IP address of instance 1. And if I curl it, I get the web page, right? Now, if I look at the public address for instance 1, if I can find it, if you go down here under the public address, you see it's 34, blah, 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 124. Now, I've already tested this, but you can see here that there's a web address here. And if I try to refresh this, it basically, oh, of course, let's see if I can paste it. Okay, if I hit enter, it should fail because I don't have a firewall rule that allows inbound from anywhere to port 80. So that's what we're going to create, and then that should allow me to show the web page here. So let me stop that. So if I can get this right, we set all this up to illustrate that we need a firewall rule to allow inbound traffic. So if I go down to VPC, where's VPC at? There it is. VPC networks. So this instance is in US Central 1, but I mean, that's just a sidebar. I want to go to the network itself. And I want to go to Firewall Rules. And I want to add a firewall rule. Let's see if I can get this on the first pass. I'm going to say allow. I'm going to try to use the naming scheme they have here. So how do they name it? They just say default allow this. So it's not default. So I'm going to say allow. Okay, I know what it is. So we're going to add a firewall rule. I'm going to call it allow HTTP, and I'm going to call this a front end. well, maybe if I follow the pattern, I would say front end and allow HTTP. Okay, so I'm going to go to this on this. Firewall rules are associated with VPCs, so it's the default network. I'll leave the default priority. It's an ingress rule. Allow specific tags. So I want to say the tag I have is called front end. So anything that has front end, this rule will apply to, which is our instance we created. And I want to source filter. So get this right. Okay, so we're going to allow from anything. Okay. So we're basically allowing anything in, and then specific ports, TCP port 80. So that's what the web runs on, right? So I think this should do it. So now, if I go down to firewall, still creating. So let's wait for this to create. So it says front end. So front end allow HTTP. It's an ingress targeting front end instances with tags of front end, which will apply to our GC1 instance. And any address can basically is allowed ingress on port 80. So if I by doing that, if all works the way I expect, see if I can get this to. Hey, there's my hello world. So that was an illustration of creating a custom firewall rule. In this case, allowing traffic in from port 80 to any instance that has a network tag of front end. Okay. So that was that. Another concept that's sort of under the hood that you don't think about much because you mostly don't mess with it, but with your VPC, there are routes. This is more relevant when you start connecting different VPCs together with like, with VPNs and whatnot. But what you do, what this is about is this is basically under the hood before traffic can move between two GC instances. The GC instance has to have a way of knowing where to find that network, right? So in this case, when you have a default VPC, it automatically creates all these routes. Basically, what you're looking at here is for every subnet, it's going to say, create a network route says for this subnet, which is a subnet for that VPC, for that subnet, it's the subnet address for the subnet. It says, this is a known address range, and it's sent it to the network, which basically sends it to the subnet itself. So you'll see if I deleted one of these, then any traffic destined to that subnet would not work. So you have all these default, one for every one of your subnets, right? And then there's one special one, which is your internet access one, which is, of course, it's hung on the next page. Let's see. Oh, it's on this page somewhere. So let me look, see. It should say destination address of all zeros. Here it is right here. So what this route is, says, this is like a catch-all route. It says, hey, if nothing else matches any address, send it to the default internet gateway, which is basically your VPC has an internet gateway, which then sends the traffic to the internet. So that's how traffic from a GC instance could go talk to the internet. So like when I send traffic from the web to the public address of my instance one, that traffic hits the VPC, hits the GC instance, but it uses this route right here to get the traffic back out to the internet. So that's what this is about. Okay. Let's talk about creating. Let's go through an exercise of creating a new VPC and just see what that looks like. So if I say create VPC, right? I'll just call it my VPC. Okay. You have, first of all, you got to decide how you're going to, is it automatically create all of the subnets for you, which that's this, or are you going to do custom? So I'm going to leave that alone, right? And then there's a dynamic routing mode, right? So what is basically let's see. Let me pause the video because I don't remember looking at this here. Give me a second. Okay, so this dynamic routing mode, I'm gonna leave it on the default. This more has to do with when you use a VPN, which is outside the scope of this video, and it has to do with how routes are propagated to through your VPN. So I'm gonna leave it on regional because that was default, and I'm gonna leave this NTU default here. So you just hit create, and of course I forgot something. I guess they're gonna force me to create a subnet. Okay. My subnet. Let me pause the video. I have to blow my nose. Okay, I'm back. So with subnets, they're regional, so I have to pick a region. So I'll create it in. I'm trying to find my US Central one. I've been using it for everything. Okay, you have to give an IP range. So I could just do 10.00.0/24, which is a kind of small subnet. And I'm not going to mess around with the Google private access or flow logs. So I hit done. Now I hit create. And of course, I forgot something. What? Why is it complaining? Do I have to have at least two subnets? That's interesting. Here, cancel here a second. Oh, Lord. My VPC. Okay. Subnet. My subnet. Region. US Central 1. 10.000/24. Off, done. Great. I guess that was just a freak of the UI. So let's take a peek at this. You pause the video until this gets created, and we'll take a peek at it. Okay, so the VPC got created. See, it's right here. It's only got one subnet, and you can see it's that 10.000/24. And if I click on the VPC itself, you will notice a couple things. One is it does not create any firewall rules. So pretty much you can't do a whole bunch with this, right? You can't, basically nothing will, by default, instances will only be able to talk to the internet or anything out, but nothing can receive traffic because nothing here is enabled, right? But there are routes created. There's a default route that says basically everything, basically the internet, any address that's not otherwise specified, right, is automatically sent to the internet gateway, but any address to the one subnet is actually sent to the subnet. So that is automatically created when you created the subnet. Okay, so the last concept we want to cover is, I guess it kind of implied here, important, is that if I have an instance in this VPC default, it will not be able to talk to anything in my VPC because, again, these are isolated VPCs. They're the same project, but they're not the same VPC. They don't automatically talk. Now, there's ways of connecting them. That's a different topic, and we'll cover that later. The last concept is, let me go to my documentation. Routes, shared VPC. The last concept is, and we can't really do this here because we don't have an organization, but it's not uncommon for a networking group, right, to create a VPC in a project, right? And then what they do is they share that VPC out. They can share subnets out of it to other projects. So then projects don't have to create their own VPCs. They can actually run their own GCE instances, but put them in the shared subnets that are in a shared project. So this pattern is not uncommon, where you might want to centralize your VPC into one project run by a certain group, but then have other teams run their own projects with their own instances, but still be able to communicate with all the other instances through the shared VPC. So that's all we're going to cover in this video, and we'll continue on with other VPC topics in the next videos.